Hi, this is Simon from writtenlegaleNglish.com and welcome to another video where we're going to be looking at a plain English redraft. In this case, we're going to be looking at a clause from the terms and conditions of a tool hire shop. So let's get started. And straight away, I've got a confession to make. We are not going to redraft this clause. I was thinking about this clause for about 20 minutes and there was no way I could redraft it in plain English and even get close to what the original message was, because it's so obscured in terrible legal drafting that there's no way for me to understand what this was trying to say. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to show you the problems of having a terribly drafted clause by simply asking ourselves, how many questions can we think of which are based on this text? And of course, the more questions you can think of based on the text, it just goes to show you how ambiguous that legal text is. So let's have a look at this clause. The title of the clause is faulty goods and or services. And from a previous video of mine, you know that and or is a terrible structure in legal English. Avoid it at all costs. I'll link to the video that I did about that a couple of weeks ago on and or. So here's the clause. Where the customer deals as a consumer, the supplier is under a legal duty to supply goods and services that are in conformity with the contract between the parties. In such circumstances, the customer has legal rights in relation to the goods that are, for example, faulty or not as described, and in relation to the services that are, for example, not carried out with reasonable skill and care, or if the materials used to carry out the services are faulty or not as described. Yes, I know. I've got no idea what that's trying to say either. Now, in case you accuse me of being a little bit unfair and taking this out of context, I trust you, I am not. This is, let me just show you the clause. This is the clause in the contract. And you can see here, section 3, faulty goods and or services. Then you've got the clause which we've just gone through, section 4, payment. That's it. So, just to put that into context, if I hired some tools from this tool shop and I had a problem with the tool or the service and I wanted to assert my rights under the terms and conditions, this complex monstrosity of words is what I have to rely on in order to say, give me my money back, which is a disaster. Clearly, this is not speaking to me as the client. I dare say the people who work in the shop won't understand what's going on either. So let's break this down and have a look at how many questions we can think of. But before we do that, I'm going to throw something else into the mix. There is a fairly big definitions section to this contract, and a lot of those terms are involved in the clause that we've just seen. For example, we can see that there's a definition for customer. We can see there's a definition for consumer. We can see there's a definition for goods, services, contract. All of these things come into play. Now, I'm not going to read through them here, so if you want to read them and they are confusing in themselves, then pause the video here and take a few seconds to read through them. Okay, assuming you've paused or not paused, let's continue. So the first thing I'm going to do is have a look at that first sentence. Where the customer deals as a consumer, the supplier is under a legal duty to supply goods and services that are in conformity with the contract between the parties. Okay. Here are some of the questions you could think of. First of all, who decides if a customer is or is not dealing as a consumer? Is there, because that's what the first clause says, where the customer deals as a consumer. So we've got two states, if you will, the state of being a customer and the state of being a consumer. Who decides when a customer is not a customer, but a customer is being a consumer? Is this based on common sense? Is there a test? Is someone there to say, yes, that's a customer, no, that's a consumer? How do we know which is which? Okay, let's move on. Can the supplier not be under a legal duty to supply goods and services in conformity with the contract? For example, what if the customer is acting as a customer? So let's have a look at that sentence. Where the customer deals as a consumer. So here we've got a condition, and that condition affects the main clause. So if the customer is a consumer, the supplier is under a legal duty. But if the customer is dealing as a customer, is the supplier then not under a legal duty? Now, of course, that's an absurd result, but this is what we can interpret from the way that this clause is drafted. So you've got problems there. So if a customer is a customer, then the supplier is under no legal duty to supply goods and services that are in conformity with the contract. So the supplier can do whatever it wants. Of course, it's crazy. We've got another issue here. There's a mention towards the end of that sentence about contract. But contract, as I said a few seconds ago, is a defined term. So is this contract as the defined term, or is this contract as something else? There's another question for you. And then the final question I just put in because it made me laugh, because the beginning of the second sentence says, in such circumstances, as if it was all clear. Well, clearly it's not all clear. It's just a disaster. So I put that in just to make me, just because it made me laugh. In such circumstances, yes, of course, I understand those circumstances clearly. So now let's move on to the second sentence. In such circumstances, the customer has legal rights in relation to the goods that are, for example, faulty or not as described, and in relation to the service. I'm not going to read the rest of it. It's just terribly drafted, and I'll come back to that in a second. So some questions that we might think of. If we've established that we're referring to a customer acting as a consumer, which was the condition in sentence 1, in sentence 2, why is there further reference to a customer? Surely we should now be talking about consumers. So in such circumstances, the consumer has legal rights in relation to the goods. Surely that should be the case? If we're talking about the customer again, then what's going on there? It's just a mishmash in legal drafting. We don't know which party we're referring to. After that, it says the customer or the consumer has legal rights. Well, what legal rights? Where can I find them? Are they statutory legal rights? Are they legal rights under the whole contract? Where are they? To me, as a consumer or customer that relies on the terms and conditions, it would be good to know where my legal rights are and not just expect me to find them somewhere. And you can imagine that problem in the tool hire shop. I would go into the shop and say, this is not working, I have rights. And then the shop would say, which rights? And then I would say, well, I don't know. It says in the contract. And then you have an argument there. So that's another issue. And then what on earth does the rest of the text mean? I've got no idea. We've got a terribly drafted structure. We've got, for example, faulty as not described, for example, not carried out with the reasonable skill or care, or. So we've got condition after condition, clause after clause. We don't know how anything works together. It's just a disaster. The sad thing is probably there's a simple message behind this clause. And probably if you go into the hire centre, the sales assistant will explain everything in plain English in a few seconds. Probably based on that sales assistant's experience of working in the shop. Probably it's the case that everyone ignores the clause anyhow because it's written in such a way no one knows what's going on. And it's more than likely, based on my experience, that it was a lawyer with no knowledge of the industry who wrote this. And more importantly, a lawyer who had no knowledge about the audience that would be affected by this. Now let's put this into context. This is a tool hire place. Now I'm not saying that people who hire tools are uneducated, or they don't know the English language, or they don't know how to understand legal text. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that if you're communicating with people who speak in plain language, and in my experience, and I used to work in the building industry many, many years ago, most people speak in very clear language. If you're going to communicate to them, you have to speak in a way that they understand. And that message about being aware of your audience is applicable to every single industry. And you'll actually find that the way you speak to one group of people, for example, in this case, it could be builders, is pretty much the same way you would talk to people from a different group. For example, investors, public investors in whatever they are investing in. The basic main message is that everyone understands plain English. That there isn't a language for some people and a language for other people. Plain language talks to everyone. That's the takeaway from this. And it's something that I say on my course, and something I emphasize a lot in my course, is that to think about your basic main message and to stick to that basic main message. Very often when you're talking, you'll be surprised at how easy it is to explain the underlying legal principle. And this is something, as I say, I get on a day-to-day basis. I get a text, I have to think about that text. If I can't work out what the lawyer is trying to say, I phone up the lawyer and the lawyer says, Simon, this is what I'm trying to say. So, brilliant, say that. Because I understand that and everyone else will understand that. So that plain English message is appropriate, it is businesslike, it is formal, it is legal. So trust in the general message, because it does everything that you want it to do and it communicates exceptionally well to the people who need to rely on that text. Just think, once again, put it into context. If there was a disagreement in the tool hire shop, what would the end of the road be? The end of the road would be a breakdown in the business relationship. I would go back to the shop and would say, the tool is not working, give me my money back. The person would say, you're not going to have your money back because the terms and conditions don't cover it. There would be a huge argument. I would just take my business elsewhere. That's what badly drafted legal documents and badly drafted legal clauses do. They make business go elsewhere. And that is the takeaway message from this video. Okay, I apologize for that turning into a sermon and for it not being a true plain English redraft, but nevertheless I thought it was an important message for you guys to take away. Please remember to check out the other videos that I've got on my channel, subscribe and like me on Facebook, and remember I've got a whole load of free legal English exercises on my website. There's a link to it below this video, and I'll see you in another video soon.